Hello, everyone. As people are populating our webinar, I just want to thank you for joining and welcome to the Center for Ethics and Human Values, Ohio State Center for Ethics and Human Values final conversation around research ethics panel for the semester. We are really excited to talk today about an issue that I think is really vexes researchers at all stages of their careers every day. And that's how to actually build ethical relations within your research teams and labs. So we are really excited to have our external panelist, Dr. Elisabeth Hildt, who is, who is a professor of philosophy and director of the Center for the Study of Ethics in the Professions at Illinois Institute of Technology. Her work focuses on philosophical and ethical aspects of science and technology. Dr. Hildt is currently a PI, or finishing up a project, or was recently a PI, on an NSF project entitled A Bottom-Up Approach to Building a Culture of Responsible Research and Practice in STEM, which is an initiative to raise students and faculty awareness of ethical issues in research labs and to improve the ethical culture of labs and departments, and hopefully which she will speak about today. We also have Dr. Tamar, who is an assistant professor of psychiatry and assistant professor of neuroscience and assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology in the Institute of Behavioral Medicine Research at OSU College of Medicine. Oh, she is now associate. Congratulations. No? Oh, wait.
Almost. In a moment. 17th. I don't want to...
Almost there. Also, really importantly, Dr. Gore is a PI for the MSTP program, as well as in the faculty leadership position for the OSU Aspire program, which focuses on creating a pipeline for historically excluded individuals in medical research. So welcome and thank you. And our final member of the panel is Dr. Zakee Sabree, who is an associate professor in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at Ohio State University. Dr. Sabree's research lab focuses on functional and trophic relationships that forge intimate host microbe interactions and shape bacterial communities and the evolutionary outcomes of these symbioses. Also working on thinking about researching and studying communities is thinking more about the postdoctoral community at Ohio State. And Dr. Sabree is currently serving as the faculty director of the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs and has worked with postdocs across OSU campus to ensure supportive and productive experiences. So I'm very excited to have all of you here, and just to let you know and thank you to the College of Medicine, the College of Public Health for helping to support these conversations. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to start with Dr. Hildt, who is going to give us a nice overview of some of these issues. And then I'm going to let Dr. Sabree and Dr. Gur talk about their own experiences, their own challenges, and sort of think the way in which you've been thinking about these issues in your daily lives. And then I have some questions that we sort of started talking about, but I also want to give ample room for participants to ask questions of your own. So if you look at the bottom, there is a Q&A icon. Please, throughout the whole discussion, post your questions there, and we are going to definitely get to those the second part of the discussion. All right, so that was all from me. Dr. Hildt, would you like to get us started?
Thank you, Dr. Howard, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me. So I'll be starting my presentation. Can you see it?
We can.
You can. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is to introduce a project we have been doing at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and it's about a bottom-up approach to building ethical cultures in STEM labs. I didn't do this on my own. We were a team with Kelly Lass from the Illinois Institute of Technology, Chris Miller, an anthropologist from Savannah College of Design, Eric Bray, biomedical engineering of the University of Texas at San Antonio, and Stephanie Taylor, a graduate student in psychology. So we were a pretty interdisciplinary team working on an NSF project with a title, you mentioned it already, a bottom-up approach to building a culture of responsible research and practice in STEM. The project began in 2016 and formally ended in 2021. But to be honest, we are still analyzing our interview results. We are still in the process of writing an article. So we are still busy with the project, basically. And yeah. So what did we do? The project had two goals. The first one was to identify factors relevant to ethical STEM, to find out what researchers think are ethical issues, ethical questions in STEM, and what would be an ethical culture for STEM labs. And the second goal was to promote the cultivation of an ethical culture in experimental labs. And we chose an approach we called bottom-up approach, in that we asked graduate students to form groups and to develop guidelines based on ethics codes, guidelines for their own research environments, for their own department, own labs that they think could be helpful to deal with ethical issues in their labs or with whatever sort of problem. Our idea was that this would be an approach that moves ethics education directly in the lab, that is not a kind of classroom education approach, that this could be, that this is an approach that helps graduate students, helps raise awareness of ethical issues, helps them cope with ethical issues. Graduate students are actively involved in the process, and our idea was that the guidelines could be useful for their own lab situation, that this would raise their awareness and could improve the ethical culture of the lab. This was our approach, or this has been our approach. And in order to achieve this, we convened graduate student committees on ethics in STEM in 4 departments of Illinois Institute of Technology. We did this in an iterative way. In the first semester, we did this in biomedical engineering and biology, because we had a biomedical engineering professor on board. And in the second semester, in the physics department and electrical and chemical engineering. And we convened these groups of students. We talked with them about codes of ethics and asked them to develop these guidelines of research ethics, RCR related, or whatever issues they thought would better, that they consider of relevance to their lab environment and to their research practice. And the groups would develop guidelines, and these guidelines would then be discussed with faculty, staff, and postdocs in the respective departments. And ideally, these guidelines could be adopted by the departments or the PIs. And if this would not be the case, they would be a kind of a way of talking together, of reflecting together. This was what we did. And to talk a little bit more about the details, how the guidelines were developed. In each of those departments, we identified one faculty member that actively supported the project, because we thought we need some active support by a faculty member within each department. And within each department, we identified a student facilitator and educated the student facilitator on the project. We talked with them about the project and what mattered in this context, that we supported them throughout the process. The students got a stipend for this, and the student facilitators at the departments helped us identify graduate students who would be interested in joining the graduate student ethics committee. Those students were volunteers, and we had around 6 sessions with these student ethics committees. First, we introduced them to ethics codes and guidelines. We identified discipline-specific ethics codes, analyzed them, talked with them about it, and then we introduced case studies and gradually moved to discussing the lab situation that the students face in their everyday research. And the case study proved helpful in this because it was a sort of prompt of kind of starting to talk about this. And then we gradually talked about the lab situation. By the way, it's not correct when I say we. The students talked without us, so we were not present in this because we thought there would be a confidentiality issue. So we were not present. We had the student facilitator who helped us do this. We were not present. We were there in the beginning to introduce the process. So the students then talked about their lab situation, about ethical issues they identified, and then they began drafting guidelines. And in the next session, they would discuss and refine the guidelines. And this was the process. The goal of the guidelines was, that's what we told them, it's not like, it's only to complement existing policies. There was no need to reinvent the wheel to have full guidelines or whatever. The guidelines should provide a complete list of ethical issues, but focus on the aspects they consider important in their life, in their research. We were assuming that there were central recurring topics, but that the guidelines would be department specific in the sense that we had science departments, engineering departments, wet labs, and computer focused work, and that the current department situation would matter recent events in the department. This is something we were not so clear about in the beginning, but this is something that turned out to be relevant. And what turned out to be particularly relevant is the role of the student facilitator. If or when the student facilitator was aware of this or that topic or wanted to push this or that topic, this identified this influenced the way the guidelines were written, the topics that were identified. So those 4 departments, they put together their guidelines. Each and every text is different, unique, of course, but we identified main themes across all 4 of these guidelines put together at IIT. First, the topic that showed up most was the role of the principal investigator. It was mentioned 14 times. Then the second most often cited topics, clearly defined expectations and responsibilities. Then work hours, vacation policies, good research practices, publication practices, and authorship. And then the next slide is about themes that showed up across 3 of 4 disciplines. Fairness, discrimination, and abusive behavior was mentioned relatively often, 14 times. Expectations, responsibilities, shared resources, safety issues, safety training, meeting with PI, and accountability. I'm aware that these are pretty general, so I have on this slide there are a few topics, a few sentences that the students put together, and I'm just going to read them. So among the topics addressed, the first, and this is just a selection. There were obviously there was a lot more text. Establish responsibilities and expectations between the student and the PI at the beginning of each research project, including timeline, salary, leave, vacation, data management, review regularly. The next one, PI should meet regularly with students regarding details of their project instead of relying on postdocs. So it should be the PI who does this. Transparency and reproducibility of experiments, keep electronic records, report what was done. Train all laboratory personnel in all relevant aspects of laboratory safety. The safety aspect showed up relatively often in our guide. No discrimination against team members based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, and disability. No use of disparaging or disrespectful language in meetings and correspondences. Train lab personnel in proper workplace behavior, especially regarding multicultural awareness, workplace harassment, accommodating those with special needs. And then working hours. This was a topic that came up relatively often. Don't force that students work more hours than a typical full-time work schedule, or that they come in on weekends and holidays. Then about teaching assistantships, research advisors need to be cognizant of the research goals of the graduate students and balance teaching assistantship duties with the other demands of the students. Don't request students to perform work tasks that are outside the realm of research. Students shall not be judged on their ability to obtain data that matches or supports the PI's hypothesis. I thought this was a very interesting one. Allow open discussion on methods and scientific topics. The principal investigator shall not assign the exact same work to two students in an attempt to force competition. Report any cases of unethical, unsafe, unprofessional conduct to the principal investigator. And the last one showed up in several guidelines in a similar way. Establish an ethics committee to review the guidelines annually, to review the past incidents and evaluate the efficacy of policies in place. So this idea that the university should have an ethics committee with students, PIs, to just talk about these things. So these were just some details out of the guidelines. To sum this up, the student side of the guideline development, the project really raised awareness of ethical and social issues in research labs in the students. It gives students a voice and empowers the students. So the students wrote down things they didn't like, and this was often the first time they did this, it gave them a voice. And what we thought was striking, topics discussed were much broader than the classical RCR topics. They included a lot of social issues, a lot about communication, harassment. You saw what I was doing. We called some of them 10 commandments. The students had a tendency to be too prescriptive in the sense of they said, you have to, you should, PI should, something like this. And we thought, okay, this was maybe not the best tone. And we tried to convince students need to avoid language that faculty may consider off-putting. This was really a point that we had to convince them or influence them a little bit that they should, that it would be perhaps a good idea to modify a bit of the word. And on the other hand, the students somehow there's the guidelines somehow revealed a need for students to adopt a culture of responsibility and of accountability, of self-ownership, in the sense that they don't have a 9-to-5 job, but they do their research work. It's a sort of experience for a future career in research. So this is something to balance. It may be too much to ask of clearly set work hours. So there is a balance here. This is the student side. And you may remember this, the students put the guidelines together, and we would then contact the faculty and ask and show those guidelines to the students. And it turned out that this was really the communication with faculty was the critical threshold in the entire project. And it was very important that the project team mediated between the graduate students and the faculty, because the faculty was confronted with those guidelines and they were not always happy about what they read. And that's why we took several steps. We began discussing in each department with two friendly faculty, the one faculty that was in the project anyway, and with another faculty we met, showed them the first version of the guidelines. Then these two faculty gave feedback and made suggestions. We gave them those suggestions to the students and asked them to take the faculty suggestions into consideration. And during this process, the guidelines were modified. And then the modified guidelines we then discussed at department faculty meetings with the entire faculty. And then the next step could have been to decide whether PIs want to adopt the guidelines in their labs, or the chairs want to, or the department chairs in their entire departments. We received a broad spectrum of reactions. You can read it from support to open rejection. So depending on, it really depended on the departments. Some departments or some people in the departments saw this as a chance to have an open discussion with students, to really have an exchange and to try to improve things. One chair even suggested to expand the approach to the entire college, because he thought this was a very good approach. Others raised concerns that the guidelines may have legal implications. From one department, we got the feedback that the guidelines were misdirected, that the guidelines were uninformed, which raises the question of who is the expert here. And we realized that there is really that power dynamics plays a huge role. Power dynamics between faculty and students, but also between senior faculty and junior faculty. There were situations where junior faculty were open towards the process, but senior faculty kind of prevented the department from having a positive, from getting involved. So in conclusion, wait a second, the project, I think, the project provided ethics education that helps students cope with ethical issues in labs, in that the project raised awareness of ethical issues and supported students, gave students a voice. The guideline development is an iterative process. The guidelines serve as a conversation piece for labs, and they could be adopted by departments or PIs in their labs. The project facilitated communication and increased mutual understanding between graduate students and faculty, which I think was very important and had an effect in itself. But it became also aware that there is a different understanding of ethics by faculty and graduate students. Faculty had more a top-down approach in mind. They focused on plagiarism, data quality, NIH and NSF requirements, whereas students with this bottom-up approach, they had a much broader approach. They focused on social issues and on aspects that may help empower them. Overall, the project raised awareness of existing regulations, and in a number of these guidelines, the students added links to existing guidelines, professional ethics codes, handbooks, so they kind of looked up what are the standards in this field. And the process is also a chance for PIs to harmonize working conditions in the various labs, because it became obvious that in certain labs there are more problems than in others. In certain labs, the PIs are more liberal, more supportive. So this is also something that the project can achieve. And on my final slide, here is a link where you can find a lot of material, a teaching guide, and resources if you would like to do a similar approach at your university. So this is the end of my presentation. Thanks a lot for listening. I'm curious about your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hildt. If you don't mind stopping to share the screen so we can see the rest of the faces. Thank you. That was like very interesting, and there's a lot of interesting like data in there. Maybe we could also now introduce Dr. Zakee Sabree. Why don't you introduce yourself, your own position, and how you've been thinking about sort of creating ethical relationships within research teams and labs?
Yeah, sure. Hey, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zakee Sabree. As Dr. Howard mentioned earlier, I work in evolutionary biology, but I think what maybe makes me most helpful here is the role that I have as the faculty director for the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs. So in this position, I advocate on behalf of about 600 plus postdocs that are at OSU, platforming their conditions, what they do, who they are to various stakeholders across campus. That includes faculty, administration, funders internally as well as externally, and human resources, and making sure that in many cases, just teaching people about what a postdoc is, because it's not exactly obvious to a lot of people. So as a result, I end up spending a lot of time thinking about the relationships that postdocs have with their PIs, with the graduate students that they may co-mentor, as well as undergraduates, other staff members, and how these interactions enable them to be productive contributors to the research enterprise.
Thank you. And Dr. Gur?
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today. As Dana Howard mentioned, I'm an assistant professor for a few more weeks in the departments of Psychiatry, Neuroscience, and Obstetrics, and in Gynecology. And I received training both in, I have an MD and a PhD, so both medical training and PhD training prior to starting my research group here about 10 years ago now. I've thought a lot about these issues, both in starting my own lab group here, as well as through my roles as an associate director of the MD PhD, the MSTP program here, where I have about 80 graduate students in various phases of training. And a major part of my role is helping them figure out which labs they want to join and dedicate their time and efforts to during the courses of their PhD, as well as where they want to go on to train for the rest of their clinical training. And then I am very lucky to be the faculty director for Aspire, which the program manager, Aaron Thomas, is a phenomenal person. If you don't know him, you should go find his office in Meiling, tell him I sent you, introduce yourself to him, because you'll be better for knowing him. And that is a program for historically excluded undergraduates here at OSU to have funded research experiences, and that's the College of Medicine, as well as nationwide. And lack of ability to financially afford to volunteer their time was identified as a major barrier to these individuals getting the research experience that all medical schools and graduate schools now require for admission. And so this was their efforts to address that. And we are starting our sixth season, my third season. Aaron calls them seasons. This in a couple weeks, May 16th, we're really excited. I think a lot about it in terms of addressing issues. And I think one of the things I think about in this is there's bad ways and good ways to address issues. I'm sure it's much more complex than that. Dr. Hildt can probably give me a lot of tips on that. But a bad way, my quickest example that comes to mind is when I first started admitting patients here as an attending, the residents were telling me their neck circumferences. And I'm a psychiatrist. That didn't seem relevant to why we were admitting this patient who was in psychiatric crisis. And I think I asked around about it. And it turned out that the year before, someone had choked on ham sandwich while in the inpatient unit. So as a QI project, they started measuring everyone's neck circumference because that's related to your risk of choking. And I'm not trying to throw anyone who does QI research under the bus. I think it's incredibly important, but for me, that's sort of they still were all eating. They didn't have special diets. There was no actual intervention based on the neck circumference, but then someone felt like they had done something to address it. And so that's a bad example of intervening in my experience to try to address an issue. And so I think a lot about good interventions and not so good interventions. And I think a lot about the well-being of undergraduate as well as graduate trainees. So I guess that lends me sufficient expertise to sit here with Dr. Sabree and Dr. Hildt, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And it is really interesting how we have like sort of people thinking about graduate, undergraduate, and postdoctoral here. So it's a nice balance. So let's start with this sort of question about the title. What does it actually mean to build ethical relations within your research team or your lab? And Dr. Sabree, why don't we start with you? And then we could go around to Dr. Gur and then Dr. Hildt.
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the things that we do as a part of advising our postdocs as a postdoctoral office. And so maybe I should just back up and say postdoctoral offices are a fairly recent development within the sort of history of academia, and that these offices seek to kind of provide a kind of institution-wide home for postdocs at universities. And they started kind of showing up within the last decade, kind of more, broadly, but a lot of universities maybe had them, sort of less institution-wide within particular departments. And so they showed up within colleges of medicine, arts and sciences, engineering, typically where you would find the largest populations of postdocs. And so they were born sometimes from both bottom up as well as top down pressures. So you had postdocs that were looking for some kind of organizing entity that could kind of, speak to their needs broadly. And then you had sort of faculty that were realizing, as well as offices of research like we have here at OSU, that were realizing that you needed some kind of organizing entity that could help to maybe provide professional development support, HR support and such for the postdocs. That would be kind of outside of what maybe faculty themselves could do, because a lot of faculty are very, very good at very kind of discipline specific things, but then there were just kind of other stuff that, unless the faculty was particularly keen on it, could fall through the cracks. And so it provided a way to kind of normalize the information that postdocs were getting, and then kind of take a little bit off the plates of the mentoring PIs. So that's just a little quick history of postdoc offices. And so our office was started a few years ago, and one of the major things that our office was attempting to do was to, help PIs and postdocs to develop much more transparent relationships. And so using tools like individual development plans as a way to kind of provide a platform for discussing expectations in terms of the research productivity as well as the professional development. Even down to the frequency of conversations between the PI and the postdoc, because a major need that was observed here was that we have a lot of postdocs that are so most of our postdocs at OSU are international, and that's actually the case at a lot of institutions, where you would have, postdocs coming in and, maybe are not fully aware of how these relationships are built. And that actually is independent of whether being domestic or international. A lot of people just don't even know how academia works until you get into it. And so these would provide kind of a context for the PI to sort of describe in a very transparent way what their expectations are, and then give the postdoc a space to be able to share them as well. And so it was about building this relationship for this kind of discussion. And so it really speaks to several points that Dr. Hildt brought up in her presentation that I really appreciate, and sort of really highlighting the necessity for transparency between the involved parties. And so in that individual development plan, one of the things that we would encourage our postdocs to do is to talk about, what they need in terms of how many hours they expect to work. Do they need to do vacation? How many publications that they, want to publish, what they're going to need to do those things. And then encouraging PIs to also have a similar kind of conversation to sort of level set, so that it would minimize the kind of conflicts that oftentimes were arising around sort of misaligned expectations.
Thank you, Dr. Gar.
You said so many of my favorite words. So transparency, I think, is something, there's sort of two, I don't want to say core principles because there's probably more than two, but there's two main ideas that, I set my lab up without doing a postdoc, which I regretted as I was listening to you speak, Dr. Sabree. I probably would have done a lot better if I had done a postdoc. But I always just worked on the principles that I was transparent with everything that I was allowed to be, that I could be transparent with. So anything that was mine to share, I share with my MSTP students, the Aspire students, or my lab group. So anything, I recently contemplated a move. I talked about that as soon as that became serious. I'm staying, but that was like something that I knew would impact my lab group significantly. And so that was something that I was transparent with as much as I could be. The second core principle is I don't ask them to do things I don't want to do myself. And we do rodent work. I was on the grand spectrum of grad students. I wasn't on the most squeamish side, but I definitely wasn't on the most comfortable side when it came to rodent work. And so I remember just saying to myself, whenever I have a lab, I'm never going to ask my student to do X, Y, or Z. And so I don't ask my students or my research scientists or my postdocs to do anything in lab that I wouldn't have done myself or felt comfortable doing. And so, we've recently completed a study in people during pregnancy, during the COVID pandemic. I studied prenatal stress. And, each step of the way, I thought to myself, would I have gone and sat in a car during COVID outside the OB's office? And I would, and I did, and so it's just really a question of, I think really thinking intentionally about these things. And I often think one of the major problems with being a grown-up is you don't remember what it's like being a kid. And that's the psychiatrist in me, I guess. And I think the same thing is true for faculty. I don't think we remember well enough what it was like to be a graduate student in the power imbalance, to be a postdoc in the power imbalance. And that's when I speak to each mentor for the Aspire program. Anyone who's going to take an Aspire student into their lab, we have long conversations about these types of issues, because it's really important, that transparency. And I don't have one word for, I don't want to start quoting tablets, but it's like basically do unto others, I think. And so I think those have been my guiding principles to good effect, as far as I'm aware, in my own research program.
And Dr. Hildt, if you would be able to define an ethical relationship, you presented so nicely about how the students were defining it. How would you think about an ethical relationship within teams and research communities?
I really want to stress that you are the experts in the field of research labs. I don't have everyday experience with this. We just only did this research project, so I don't want to claim to have a lot of real life experience in this, even though I'm a biochemist by training. So I do have quite a bit of that. I think what struck us in the interviews is that Dr. Sabree said something like they don't know how to build ethical relationships. I think this is something that I thought is something that matters, and that it would be good to have some mentoring, train the PIs, the postdocs, also the graduate students, kind of help them be more aware of this. The graduate students, we also did interviews, and in those interviews, the graduate students stressed a lot that it's the PI who who sets the tone of the lab, the PI who plays such a central role in the labs. But the PIs, they may not always be so aware of this, that the students think it's them. And the students, they may look at others and think, oh yeah, the PI should do X, Y, and Z. And while saying this and while talking about the PI, they forget that they too have a role in the lab, and they too could play an important role in this. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And so I'm just looking at the Q&As, and there's some like really great questions from participants. So here's a few more questions just, and I'm not going to call on everybody. So if you want to respond, feel free to just unmute yourself. But the first question is really about just sort of structural features and institutional barriers that you found in your own experiences that have threatened or undermined these sorts of processes of building transparent and sort of ethical relationships within the research team. And as you sort of, if you have any sort of examples of this, I'm also interested in whether you think individual researchers, individual PIs have certain powers to mitigate or overcome these sorts of structural barriers. And if you've seen in your experience sort of examples of that.
Dr. Smith, you're unmuted. Do you want to talk, Dr. Sabree? Do you want to go, or do you want me to?
You can go ahead.
I do think that we each have, each PI individually does have the power to address it. I think that I was listening to NPR on the way in today, and that's a very professory statement. I was listening to NPR on the way in today, and they had a part of a TED talk by a firefighter, and basically it was like, today might not be the day you can save someone's life, but you can affect someone's life to good. And I do think that panels such as this, and in general, just I have done the mentorship training through the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs. That was really superbly done, and just availing yourself of those resources and being aware. I mean, I think that was one of the major take homes for me from Dr. Hildt's presentation, is that faculty in general are not aware. And I think that that's true from my interactions with many faculty members through my roles, is just they don't know what they don't know. And that's in this space, especially, it's very dangerous. You know, and I don't want to speak to others' lived experience, but to my lived experience, I have 4 kids, which is pretty unusual in my line of work. And I can't tell you the number of times I was asked if I was coming back from my maternity leave. You know, like, as this was just like a whim or a hobby, I don't know. And so I think that just, you know, words matter. You know, I look forward to getting tenure in a few weeks. Maybe I'll go on an even bigger soapbox, but words matter. And that message is really loud, can be very loud and very harmful. And so, and I don't care what that person's intent was. What I experienced was doubt of my passion for my job, since I seem to be so frivolous as to procreate this many times, right? You know, that was what I heard. And so it's just, or my maternity leave referred to as a vacation. I mean, I could go on probably for the rest of the panel discussing all the things that have been said to me. And, you know, I usually just make a joke. My husband's an OBGYN here, so I just make a joke about how he's just never told me how to prevent it. And then the person gets very concerned, and I feel like they deserved it. But that to be said, like, I really feel like absolutely we can make a difference. And then on a small scale in our research groups, but then really importantly, on a larger scale by reaching out and, you know, not just through mandatory reporting, which I am and I have done, but through meetings such as this one, and within our own programs, our departments, our centers, our institutes, making a concerted and combined effort across institutions, as Dr. Hildt is doing, to continue to bring awareness to it.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. I think the only bit that I can add to that is that I do think that postdocs, graduate students, undergraduate students, many of them kind of know what is missing in their experiences. I think the faculty oftentimes, as it relates to the people that are working with us and who are mentoring, we could be, in many ways, not aware. I think that Dr. Gurr makes an excellent point about how time past can allow for some sort of clouding of our perspectives on what it was like then. And so I think mentorship training is, should be essential for faculty. I mean, we certainly, for some granting agencies, have to kind of fill out some, do a little workshop or whatever online at, about responsible conduct and research and such, which is, I think useful. But as far as, making us aware of our positionality, I think that is vastly lacking. And so that impairs, I think, faculty from having the empathy for, where people are in their, different parts of their career. And so training that really highlights for faculty, what your position is, not only as a, scholar in your field and a successful person, but, and like in my case, an African-American man, who could be mentoring, a wide variety of people and what that brings to the table, how that impacts engagement and all of that. And so in both directions. And so I think that this is, something that we could be doing more of. I think that we have put in place requirements for training along a number of other dimensions that exist at the university that are really important. And I think that mentorship of our students, postdocs, the training around that should be, if not mandatory, it should be rewarded. And so this should be a part of our annual reviews, where it's, if you have done, said trainings, that there should be some, goes into how your raise is calculated, or, can be valued in terms of your service, or even your teaching allocations. And so I think it doesn't have to just be all sticks. I think that there are some very clear carrots in this, and not just for the individual, but those things then tend to sort of shape the institution and can help to sort of restructure what are the values, or how our values manifest and are acted upon within our institutions.
Thank you. So now I'm going to jump into some questions and sort of combine them with some of the questions that we were sort of thinking about before the panel. But I think so one anonymous participant said, is it possible that some of these issues brought up by the grad students is generated by this tension between being a student and being a worker? Being a graduate student and postdoc can sometimes feel like neither. So you don't feel like you have the workers' rights, but it also isn't as if you aren't working and providing labor. And one of the questions that I've been really interested in, and Dr. Sabree, you've mentioned that many of the postdocs are new immigrants or are visiting scholars from international students. And it is this sort of interesting thing where it's like, not only are you a worker / researcher, right, but you're also, your status in this country is related to your productivity and your good standing in the institution. And so I'm wondering how we should think about these sorts of potential intersections of people's positionality, and how to negotiate and navigate those kinds of relationships within a research team.
Okay, this is very exciting, in part because I was talking with a colleague and preparing for this about, what am I going to talk about? I don't know anything. And one of the things that I was suggested to mention, and you brought this up, wonderfully here, Dr. Howard, is how one's visa status, can impact self-advocacy, how it can impact their independence, because as a postdoc, and in some cases with graduate students too, there is a persistent interdependency that exists between that person and their PI, right? And that's going to that could have a huge impact on how that person negotiates with their PI, how they maybe will whistleblow, how they could, mentor up, and also the self-advocacy. And then if you layer on top of that visa status, that can become, really quenching of, having this sort of minimally hierarchical or, kind of reducing that distance of power between the interacting people. So yeah, no, this is absolutely a major issue. And so some of the remedies we think are having an independent entity like a postdoc office that, can go and talk to PIs, not necessarily one-on-one to say, you're not doing a great job, but by facilitating these types of faculty mentoring workshops. Also, we can advocate for postdoc or even trainee specific HR policies that help to clarify the position of postdocs and graduate students at the university, so that all of the sort of attendant bodies are aware of like how to engage with them, because that's a major part of what I've done in interacting with human resources, wonderful people there who, because of just churn, each year we can have, a different workforce by 20 to 30%. And so educating them about who these people are and how their needs in some ways are unique at the university relative to maybe staff members and faculty and undergraduate students, it's really important. So that's why in some ways propping up offices like ours can be very, very useful in helping to address these issues.
I absolutely agree. I mean, mentorship training, I think, is really important, and also institutional support at the institutional level. And we did interviews with a number of graduate students, and some of them were international students, and some of these international students really stress the pressure they feel under with the need to finish their PhD thesis, their dissertation in time because of the visa, with the need to comply with whatever the PI requests from them, because they don't want to run into issues. They really have to finish their dissertation when their visa stops. They really have to have money and all of this. So I absolutely agree. And some office like yours or committee or whatever would be extremely helpful.
So maybe, so we only have, so there's two questions that I want to get to, so that are from the participants. So the first is a question to Dr. Hildt. Did you follow up with students after sharing the guidelines to faculty? If so, how did the students respond to the different faculty responses? Imagine open rejection would be fairly demoralizing, for example. And just sort of to broaden that question, we've been talking a lot about these kinds of institutional mitigation processes that, and in some ways empowering postdocs, graduate students, sort of junior scholars to advocate for themselves and for more transparency. But what happens when some of these policies end up not necessarily making change to their own experience, their own sort of research? How should we think about that? And is there a possible demoralization about trying to institute policies that don't end up actually, that are bottom up, that don't end up actually making top down changes culturally within the institution?
So with the open rejection that I put on the slide and that I mentioned, I mean, we moderated the process. The team members met with the faculty, showed them the guidelines, discussed with them, and it was us who experienced the open rejection. We then asked the student and the faculty to do their modifications, and the less they were interested in this, the less they were involved in the process. And we just we then went back to the students, and the more rejection the faculty showed, let's put it that way, the less the iterations could go forward, but it's just stopped somewhere because it just didn't. So we didn't say, oh, Professor X was so, we didn't say anything like that. We moderated the process. About demoralization, this is a good point. This could be a danger in the sense of we did these guidelines, so we tried to achieve change and we didn't achieve anything. That's a point. In our case, I think the process was that a number of, or most of the graduate students did finish within a year or so with their dissertation, because those students who have been in labs for quite a long time, they were the most interested in participating in these ethics committees. And then the pandemic was also a factor that kind of put an end to our activities, which is a shame, but which is what happened.
I just want to put a plug in for failing. I think that actually a lot can be learned from conflict and from even what I would consider like a negative outcome from conflict. I think in general that still turns a page and makes progress. And so I just want to put a plug. I mean, I've been a part of a bunch of failed initiatives to try to address these issues. And I think that each time the effort was still worth it. And I think that it still positively contributed to the lived experience of the students or the trainees, even when it wasn't successful on paper, it wasn't further disseminated. I think that not trying is the ultimate, giving up and not trying is the real loss here.
So I'm hearing one major theme that I'm hearing from all of you is, there are these built-in power relationships between the different members of the team. And part of the strategies, both institutional and individual, are about mitigating those sorts of differentials and adding transparency and guidelines, but not necessarily like getting rid of these power differentials that are just built into the relationship. So the last question, and this is sort of an open invitation also to just share your thoughts in general about how to deal with this sort of process of addressing these power differentials in a way that just makes things more transparent, is about the difference between recruitment and retention. And so, there's been a lot of effort when it comes to diversifying, especially within the STEM field, and diversifying our community of researchers. But often that comes from the recruitment side, Dr. Gur, bringing up the actual roadblocks and material challenges to even having those students be able to be recruited that's an important component, right? But anyway, so but retention is a different thing. And one of the things that one of the anonymous attendees asked was sort of how much of these conflicts or disagreement between grad students and PIs are a matter of generational divides, or sort of or possible PIs having an attitude, well, I worked X hours and did all this as a grad student, so you should too. So how should we think about the differences between retention versus recruitment, and really sort of meeting the needs of the all the members of the research team who are already part of your team?
I'll just hop in there. So I think that, it's become pretty clear to me, and I think, others on this panel would agree that, good behavior, just like bad behavior, can be intergenerational, right? And oftentimes, it exists. The next generation typically picks up on what, either they were sort of immersed in, and then what they saw was successful. And so if you have a PI that is behaving in some problematic ways, but they are being validated in those ways that the field, the institution, is able to provide, then that can validate then those poor behaviors, just like, those good behaviors. So, I think that, I'm going to take off my postdoc office hat for a second and put on my faculty hat and say that, it's a lot of work to be a faculty person. And, we're oftentimes having to juggle a lot of flaming chainsaws. And so as a part of that, being asked to do more training, to do these things can oftentimes seem onerous and just another kind of time suck. But I think that this is where our institutions need to validate for us that this is important. This actually will improve your productivity and, create the opportunities for us to improve our abilities to be better mentors and better educators. I don't know if that means we all get our own, personal assistants or someone to write our grants for us. But being able to, take things off of our plates so that we can focus on, just being better PIs, I think is really important. And this is one thing that I think our institutions could look at in terms of not just simply a recruitment thing, but also a retention issue as well, and retention of faculty.
So we have reached time. I want to also plug, Marcelo Hernandez wanted to add just sort of a mentoring resource. A resource at OSU for workshops for faculty. I've also taken it and I found it to be tremendously helpful and thoughtful. It's https://u.osu.edu /OSMI. It's like really wordy and horrible. So we'll just put that under when we make this video accessible. We'll put this along with Dr. Hildt's resources that she provided in the PowerPoint slide underneath so that people can access it. Thank you very much for your contributions. The hour is always so short, and there's a lot of questions that we still need to think about as a community at Ohio State. But I appreciate you being here and your time. Bye, everybody.
So much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.